Welcome to Books in Five. My name is Pavan, and I'm going to be interviewing credible authors of recently published books on relevant topics. I'm very excited today because I recently read this great new book about Canada. It's called The Big Fix, and you can see it over my shoulder. I have the authors with
Ooh,
us here today. We have Vass and Denise. Welcome.
hi.
Hi, thanks for having us.
Of course, yeah. Let's get right into it. I'm going to be asking you five questions, and we're hoping to get 5 minutes of your answers for them. Let's jump into question number one. The economy is a dynamic system that is always changing, but what you describe in the book is a country that is now being dominated by a handful of very large companies who have such power over the market. How did we get to this point, and why is it an issue?
Yeah, it's a great first question. And I love that you also said essentially that the economy is this complex adaptive system that's constantly morphing and shape shifting. And especially now in Canada with our geopolitical situation, it's going to change very dramatically in the next, year. But some things that don't change are, they seem almost eternal, are the
Mm,
fact that um, in markets, they tend towards a concentration of a few actors, a few small, well, a few very large players. And that's not inevitable, but it certainly is something that we've seen over the last sort of 4 to 5 decades. Vass, and I think that part of the reason that that has happened is because since the 1980s, we sort of had this idea that you should just take your hands off of markets and markets should freely organize themselves. And that as long as we didn't interfere in the kind of natural process of markets, that
mm,
that would produce the best outcome. We disagree with that. We think that markets are made and remade all the time. We think that markets are not just some esoteric thing, that actually they're this complex interaction between corporations and the government and the populace. And we get to shape the terms of markets. We get to shape, how they function, what rules are they governed by. And so maybe I'll turn it to Vass to kind of take us from here. But that's the general idea: is that markets need caretakers, just like a garden or any other sort of natural phenomenon.
To pick up on what Denise just offered, which was so fantastic, how did we get to this point? There's us as Canadians, and then Denise is offering us this global context, right? How did we get here historically, and right now with this moment of economic nationalism, like the 80s are back, sovereignty is back. We're having the national champion conversation again in Canada in this moment. We're looking more inwards, and trade, what's happening with trade is really kind of maybe shifting our attitudes towards markets or reminding us of our active role and our ability to make and remake markets and the role of policy of all kinds, right? So, in terms of how we got here, Denise and I would also put forward that in our limited thinking historically about what competition policy is in Canada, right? It's not just the Competition Act. There are all sorts of levers and interventions that we have and that we make that do that making and reshaping of markets. And when we do take our hands off the wheel, it's never the case that a market is totally idealized and free and fair. What we see and what we observe and what we can point to is that de facto private regulators are happy to fill up that space, happy to set the rules of markets, typically in their favor. And by the way, markets that are algorithmically governed, they aren't free either. That's a computer program intervening and making decisions for us, whether or not, they're slightly influenced by our consumption and things like that. So no matter what, we always start from this place of we have power, right? It's not just buying power, purchasing power, boycott power, but policy power to create the kind of markets that we want.
And obviously, it's an issue, right? And we're seeing that. Just talk about for the final minute for this question is,
Mm.
how do we even recognize that it is an issue? We have journalists, we have the media, we have people talking day to day of the fact that we are experiencing such large companies just owning everything and selling everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the average sort of everyday citizen in Canada experiences this probably multiple times a day in all kinds of ways. You've got Visa and MasterCard or Amex, well, not Amex, sorry, in Canada, but
We rarely
there's
accept Amex in Canada.
yeah, there's sort of monopolies and duopolies everywhere. And as you
Mm,
go about your day-to-day transactions and your day-to-day life, you're likely transferring a little bit of your paycheck to a monopolist or an oligopolist, right? Every time you buy your groceries, if you book a flight, when you go to bank, when you're paying for insurance, or even as a worker, you may have fewer options as a worker if
mm.
you are trying to get a job in a highly concentrated market. So these are the things that we started kind of philosophically and esoterically, but really, we think it's an issue because it's a huge reason why inequality has gotten so bad in recent years. It's a big reason why workers have less bargaining power. And there's lots of really important economic and social consequences of this concentrated corporate power.
Let's move on to our second question, which is you describe how the concentration that is now taking place across industries hurts consumers in the present through high prices, but also the economy of the future as monopoly power stifles innovations and kills newer companies. Can you talk a little bit more about this in Canada as startups struggle to get off the ground and smaller firms go out of business?
Thanks for bringing entrepreneurs into the mix, right? It's so typical that we take this consumer centric view. Also, we take, huge issue with always framing or our default frame of citizens as consumers, but that's a whole separate question. That's a bonus round. A lack of competition hurts workers of all kinds, right? Including entrepreneurs and startups, as well as us when we're kind of buying something, right? And it affects, you mentioned Canada's startups. We always hear Canada doesn't have a startup problem, we have a scale up problem. But when we took a look at the number of startups over time in Canada, that's been going down while our population has been growing, right? That's not a great indicator. Something that I know blew Denise's mind, if I could say, is I think in 2023, is it 2023 now? Because we read the book last year, slightly over half of what went public on the TSX were ETFs, financial products. Am I correct? I'm like fact checking myself with Denise with my mind meld.
No, I think it was higher. It was like 87% or something.
No, oh my God.
No, it was real. Okay, we're gonna fact check
We're going to
ourselves,
fact check ourselves. So wait, and some of the work, Denise has done deeper work on this in the US, right? Not just, we talk about access to capital for a lot of startups, right? Oh, there's not enough venture, we need to kind of think bigger or be willing to take those early risks. And we don't have a parallel conversation about access to markets, right? How are markets structured? What are the barriers to entry? How realistic is it that you're going to have a new entrant? Now, this isn't a type of startup, but Canada certainly has an appetite for more grocery stores, and we have some variety kind of in local bodegas and things like that. We had our former Minister of Innovation, Science and Economic Development do a very Canadian thing. He went internationally and he asked other companies nicely to come here. Guess what? They didn't. Why? We don't we don't have foreign, rules on foreign competitors for grocery. What are the true barriers? What's the reality of how the market has been constructed, co-constructed, how it's governed? What's stopping someone from coming in? It's probably not just having the idea. You know what I mean? And we need to be thinking about that and appreciating that more. In Canada, especially when we have research from the Competition Bureau and from Statistics Canada showing an erosion, a decline in the measurable dynamism of our country.
Denise, we'll give you maybe 90 more seconds. Let's talk a little bit about the specific example you bring up in the book about the film industry.
Oh yeah, actually
Oh
that
my
was
God.
Vass's section, but I'll take a stab at it. So yeah, I think Vass really nicely kind of laid out this notion of access to markets, right? And the idea is that people think, okay, as long as you can scrounge, you've got a great idea, you can
Mhm.
scrounge up enough capital and maybe, a few people around you to support that, like that's the origination of a great business idea and plan. And then you can go into the market and the market will tell you whether it is useful or not. But the problem is, in so many industries, there's some sort of dominant gatekeeper that actually makes it very difficult to reach customers, or you have to pay enormous tolls to kind of get to customers. And in the example that we use in the book about cinemas, so it's kind of a complex ecosystem, but we have Cineplex in Canada, which if you go to the movies, you're going to probably go to a Cineplex. They have a monopoly on exhibiting movies, exhibiting films in Canada. And if you're an indie theater, if you're a little independent theater, um, you actually don't get access to the same films at the same times as the big players. And so you might have to wait a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to show a new release that's coming out in the big theaters. Well, obviously, the opening weekend of any film is like the highest grossing time for a film, right? So that's an access to markets issue. They don't have access to the same content. And so it harms their ability to actually be successful. And you can replicate that kind of story across many different industries, where it might be that you have to pay Amazon or Google high percentages of your revenue for advertising. And meanwhile, you're competing, if you're on Amazon, you're competing against Amazon and you have to pay them to reach the eyeballs of the same customers, right? So there's lots of things like that where markets are not actually equal. There's not equal access.
You brought up Amazon, which is a great segue to our third question, which is we're very familiar with these so-called everything companies like Amazon that try to cater to consumers in every category. But Canadians may not know that we have a few massive players on our home turf that are attempting to insert themselves into every aspect of our lives. Which companies are they, and why is this a concern?
Yeah, so we liked this idea of everything companies because we think it describes that idea that basically companies are no longer interested in just dominating one industry or one sector, but they want to kind of collect assets across industries or be successful across multiple things. And a company like Amazon, of course, it's totally unrivaled. It's like the quintessential everything company. They use their early, success in publishing and sort of like in selling books online to now doing everything from logistics to transportation to hair salons, to grocery store. I mean, they are sort of absolutely everywhere. And actually, that was part of their strategy initially. They said, we're going to reverse engineer a consumer's day and we're going to try to find every single place that they spend money. And that's exactly where we want to be, is in every single transaction, no matter what it is, pharmaceuticals and so on. So in Canada, we don't have anything, of course, that's at the size and scale of Amazon, but there are certain brands and retailers that are, emulating Amazon and how they are trying to be involved in multiple industries and also reach customers with their own private label products. So maybe I'll turn to Vass because she's our private label expert.
Oh my gosh, the private labels. Yes. I mean, look, increasingly we were observing that firms in Canada were owning and operating their kind of micro marketplaces. So they were competing against independent suppliers, but owning not just the shelves, fine, that's kind of historically something we're used to, but these online ecosystems where the price, just like the price for you and I of using certain social media companies, can be so exorbitant in terms of the privacy and the data and the information that we give up, but that independent suppliers get put at a particular disadvantage because suddenly to sell through Canadian Tire or not the Bay anymore, or what we've seen, in the US with Target, suddenly the price is that Target's now going to know all the places that are selling this beautiful lavender, very popular water bottle, the demographics of people likely, right, who are purchasing them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they can not only price discipline that competitor out of the marketplace, they can also just physically kick them out. We've seen Loblaw do this with a particular brand of ketchup. There was a secret memo that was leaked. This is like a throwback to 2007. And it's so kind of silly and lazy when you read about it, right? This idea that people aren't buying our product, they prefer this competitor, but it doesn't inspire you to make a better product or offer a more competitive price. What it just inspires you is to flex your interesting, newer kind of market power and kick them out of your marketplace altogether. So that's one of the concerns we wanted to bring forward. Like, what does it mean? What does it feel like? And how does it change the terms of competition? And is that appropriate? I'll just close. We didn't include Canada's biggest digital company, Shopify. But don't forget, Shopify has a lending function, right? It solves for access to capital for some of its merchants, as a payment processing system. It also has physical terminals for payments that it will offer people. Like, you could argue that that's a move to kind of create a kind of ecosystem that keeps people within, a particular banner that accrues a lot of e-commerce information to one company. Again, I'm not saying whether that's good or bad. It's just a reality of how firms are evolving. And just to close with the Bay, RIP, right? This is a company that's older than the history of Canada. Literally gave land back to Canada. Took it from others, but Rupert's Land. Move away from that, Vass. We have a quote in the book about how the Bay saw itself as fundamentally being a real estate company, not a commerce company. So even how companies think of themselves and how they're investing may be detracted from the Bay focusing on what the customer experience was like or what their investments were like online. Just to close.
That's a great summary of these everything companies in Canada. Let's move on to our fourth question, which is all about competition policy. You mentioned it earlier, but I really want to get into it with this one. It may not be as well known or as in your face as other responsibilities of the government, but it is such a critical factor in supporting a healthy economy that is fair to all players. Can you highlight what is competition policy and why it hasn't served Canadians well over the past few decades?
I love this question because I think you're right that like if you go to parties and you say I work on competition policy, maybe the parties that Vass and I go to,
Yeah, it was
people
I think that's why we get
people love
invited to
it.
parties. Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. But probably like any other party,
Yeah,
there's not going to be
probably.
like a high level of recognition about what it is or why it's important. I tend to like to actually not use the term competition policy. I like to say, thinking about how to make the economy more equitable, or thinking about how power works and how to deconcentrate power, things like that, because to me that's ultimately what competition policy is meant to do. It looks at it really has a mandate. It has specific functional mandates like looking at mergers, reviewing mergers, consumer protection, and also going after bad behavior. So, things that are anti-competitive, things that harm consumers and workers, as we've talked about. But, ultimately, I think it's a way of evaluating and really asking some pretty deep questions about what we want the economy to do for us. And it's a way of trying to spur innovation. It's a way of trying to make sure that, by the way, like big isn't bad. That's something Vass and I like to say. So a firm being successful is a great thing, and we need Canada to have successful companies. What we don't want is success that is built on illegal behavior. We don't want success that is because people are tying their products or I don't know, something. It's a technical term called an abuse of dominance. But we don't want, once somebody has been successful, we don't want them to just be continuing to be successful because they're abusing that success in the marketplace, essentially. And so competition policy is one of those things that sits not only at the Competition Bureau, which is our regulatory body that is responsible for doing all the things I mentioned, but also is really, we think, a way for the entire government, for the entire economy to really be thinking about these issues, because competition policy affects environmental policy, it affects labor, intellectual property rights, foreign investment, trade, and all these other areas intersect competition policy. So we think obviously that it's pretty important, and that when it's done right, it can have really dramatic effects across the entire economy. But unfortunately, one of our kind of sad factoids in Canada is that we've never, through the Competition Bureau, actually blocked a single merger in our whole sort of history. We have
never blocked. Okay, to the Bureau's credit, we've modified mergers. We have mandated particular divestitures before a merger goes forward. We haven't been nobody is in the control room at the Competition Bureau, asleep or something, letting mergers go through the fence or something. But Denise is right. That's a heritage minute that we don't want to see on YouTube. We want to see the Competition Bureau successfully block mergers when it attempts to, when it deems them anti-competitive and bad for the economy. Because what is competition policy? Competition policy makes markets work, right? Makes the economy more free and fair, sets the terms of those marketplaces that we were talking about. Teeny tiny thing to close on. Didn't make it into the book because it happened after the book, but what is one of the last things that former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau did before he posted his selfie at Canadian Tire because he had to buy home goods? He did an order in council, something Denise and I debated as a policy tool, separate conversation, for capping insufficient banking fees in Canada at $10. Now, this was a budget commitment. People, was put in the window by the government. That's not the Competition Act, but it's competition policy. Canada had some of the highest NSF fees in the world for a long time. Why? Because they could. I tried to game this out from the opposite side. I'm like, does the fee have to be, higher to be more of a deterrent, to keep a certain amount of money in your account? This is something that hurts the least well-off people who can afford the least and, is unnecessarily high. And I thought that was a cool kind of quiet mic drop and sent a shot at the banks on the way out. Again, did it make mega headlines? No, but I thought it was pretty ballsy.
You know, what you're bringing up is a great opportunity for us to move to our final question, which is all about solutions, right? Your book concludes with important recommendations for policymakers and leaders to consider for a future Canadian economy that is more vibrant and more competitive. Walk us through the title of your book, The Big Fix, as it relates to these solutions, to these issues that we've been discussing.
Okay. The big fix is a triple entendre. The first alludes to that feeling that markets are fixed. They just don't work. You're kind of stuck. The odds are, not in your favor. The second is a kind of cheeky allusion to ideas that get kicked around in Canada and positioned as being quote unquote big fixes that are almost zombie ideas, and we don't think they'll be the revolutionary kind of fix that the economy needs. And the third is our big fix, which is taking a more expansive, holistic, integrated view of competition policy through a whole of government approach. So diffusing the policy power and concern for when we're doing something, what does it mean for markets, right? Recognizing that if we can move farther on pharmacare, that pharmacare is competition policy. Pharmacare is about drugs and patents and timelines and payment systems, right? That would be an example. Calling more on the provinces and even things at the municipal level. So the good news for Canada, and we did want to present a kind of optimistic, joyful vibe, which is not the easiest thing to do when you're talking about competition, right? We also wanted to remind people there's a bunch of stuff that Canada gets right, and that we have the kind of scaffolding, or there are elements in place that are clues, kind of the foundation of this whole of government approach. And that's not just the recent legislative changes we've seen over the past 3 years now, which are really promising. But Denise and I wanted to say, look, tinkering and modernizing legislation is actually the start of this work. It's not the conclusion of it. So what's next and where else can we look? And we're really hopeful that in this election, though it feels like a state of trade emergency, that we'll see some of those ideas coming forward in terms of how can we make markets even more vibrant and appropriate and exciting in Canada to attract investment and attract people here. But I'm rambling a little bit. I'll turn it to you, Denise.
No, I think that was great. And yeah, it does feel like a major window of opportunity to really be asking those big questions. I think there is a tendency in a moment like this to say, oh, okay, we have to shore up Canada's, companies and our companies that have been in markets, many of them for over 100 years. And, I think that is in some ways attractive in a moment like this. I think in other ways, we really need to be conscious of not just continuing to shore up companies that are failing to innovate, that are sort of resting on their laurels because they don't have that much competition, and that are actually harming, Canadian consumers and workers. And so, are there ways in which we can foster a more dynamic and innovative economy that is, in some cases sort of protectionist, and which shores up our ability to manufacture in Canada and to relocalize and reshore some of that capacity, without needing to then necessarily give like a a full blank slate pass to existing companies, because the reality is that when companies are sort of have been in the position that they've been in for too long, then actually it is the case that many times they are not very innovative. They're not very efficient. They're kind of like lumbering giants. They're big dinosaurs that are not necessarily adding to the nation's productivity or to growth or any of the things that we desperately need. And the way to foster that is to not to like demonize or punish them, but to make sure that they are really taking the necessary steps that they need to be taking to make sure that markets are open and accessible to new entrants, and that they themselves are also innovating. So we think that it's a really cool time for for competition policy in this moment, and hopefully well into the future as well.
Amazing conclusion to your book, but also to our 5 questions here. We've been with Vass and Denise, the authors of The Big Fix, a book that is necessary for the times that we live in now. Thank you so much for joining me today. How did you get into this line of work, this line of questioning, being an author and wanting to fix the economy?
In terms of the culmination of some of our intellectual partnership and kind of thinking together through this book project, that's just kind of one part of the work we've been doing and each have been able to do, right? I had been learning from Denise for a long time as kind of like a fangirl. I had read The Myth of Capitalism. I saw her online. I followed her. She followed me back. And that was my first clue. I was like, okay, she must think I'm really cool too, because like she followed me back and like yada, yada, yada. And then friends kind of knew each other. Anyway, that's kind of starting to meet, but a long way of saying sometimes your brainy life goes in unexpected places, right? I didn't have like a minor in economics or, study the Competition Act when I was in graduate school, but through this wonderful invitation, this very generous prize that we received from McGill, we received the challenge, right? The invitation to, in a short period of time, in slightly less than a year, to develop this project. The book is a short king because it had to be. The book was 30,000 words. And also I'd be like, if we hand in 37 words, 37,000 is not that big a deal, blah, blah. Denise was like, I'm pretty sure it has to be like 30,000. I'm like, let's just hand in 45,000 and like get their take on what we should cut. It's like, no, we have to like, this was the job that we had to do. And it was a great forcing function to work with those constraints. Because I do think there's another universe where you could write a book like this forever. You could just keep researching. There's more stories to tell and rocks to look under. And that's work that does continue through friends and colleagues of ours. But, we wanted to offer a snapshot and a primer for the appetite that we knew was out there to kind of have people get their footing in how have markets changed? Why does it matter? And what is this thing called competition policy? Because it seems like something that's kind of alienating or maybe exclusive to lawyers and economists, but we wanted to be like, no, it's about everyone. Like it's about us and what we want to do. And, if we can help someone discover that through, one of our chapters, then that's a huge honor.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. There's kind of, I think unless you have written books, you maybe assume that they are like the sum totality of an author's thinking. And what they really are more is like a snapshot in time of your evolving learning process. But for me, I mean, I was really fortunate, 6 years ago to be asked to co-author a book called The Myth of Capitalism, which was looking at these issues in the US. And I was really interested in like, what is actually causing this massive inequality? And of course, there's so many answers to that question. It's very complex, but we wanted to look at the kind of macroeconomic drivers. And so that's what really kicked me into learning about competition policy and antitrust as a tool to kind of, try to get at concentrated corporate power. And then as a Canadian who, is extremely loyal to this country, despite having lived in a lot of other places, it was a real honor to be able to translate some of that knowledge back into a Canadian context and think about, really some like very uniquely Canadian challenges to this problem. So I found that really intellectually rewarding. And then working with Vass, I'm also a big fangirl of hers, of course. And so it felt like just a dream kind of partnership in so many ways. I was going to say one other thing. What was it? Just that, like, I guess to anyone else that's starting out, I think, yeah, you can look at maybe when you see Vass on TV and you think, oh my God, she's like so smart and she's so amazing, which she absolutely is. But I think it's important for people to know, like, if you dedicate enough time and and sort of like your own resources and energy to learning a topic, nothing is out of bounds for you. And I knew nothing about this, like at zero, 5 or 6 years ago. And now we're writing books and seen as experts in this space. And so I think it's just important for people to know that, if you have an inkling of interest in something, just pursue it. And you really never know where it's going to go.
Totally.
That was a great insight. Let's finish with the final question. What are you working on next, together or separately? Writing projects, being directors of policy schools,
we did
right?
one project together recently.
Yeah.
So I was like, but we're not working on it anymore. / who knows when they're going to get back to us with edits. But no, Denise is probably working on cooler, actually active things right now.
No, well, I have a part-time position at a research center at Columbia called the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment. And I've been doing some new research into kind of nature-related data, biodiversity data. So that's really interesting, a little bit away from competition policy stuff, but still relevant. And then I'm also collaborating with an organization in San Francisco called the Long Now Foundation, which tries to get us to think in 10,000-year increments about sort of big civilizational challenges and how to be thinking about and responsive to really long-term, multi-generational kind of survival and thriving kind of questions. So that's been really fun as well.
Amazing. Denise, Vass, thank you so much for joining us here on Books in 5.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
Keep
you.
up the great reading. Happy reading.
And again, the title of the book is The Big Fix.
How companies capture markets and harm Canadians, which I had to practice saying because I think I used to do it wrong sometimes. I typed it wrong to Denise once. She's like, that's not the subtitle. I'm like, what is it?
The host of Books in 5 is Bhavan Sodhan. Books in 5 is produced in collaboration with Podfather Creative in Vancouver, Canada.